The relationship between freedom and manumission is really complicated in antiquity. And I think part of this is that when we hear manumission, we often think like okay, emancipation, freedom from slavery, gaining legal personhood, legal citizenship, and that wasn't always the case in antiquity.
Welcome back to It Means What It Means. I'm your host, Jared. I'm trying another different intro variation out. Maybe I'll go back to the tagline. Maybe I won't. It was brought to my attention that I hadn't been identifying myself, and I think that was something that I just didn't think was necessary because I figured the content of the interviews was the important part. But in retrospect, of the myriad podcasts I listen to, they pretty much all identify themselves. So, okay, got that out of the way. Today's guest is Chance Bonar. He is the third person that I have spoken to, but this is the second episode around the book Ancient Slavery in its New Testament Context. And yeah, this was a really fun conversation. He was somebody I had seen off and on, probably mostly on Twitter, but on social media posting stuff. So I'm glad. I was excited when I saw his name in the table of contents for this book. So I will not hold up the conversation anymore, except to say if you are listening for free, I appreciate the support. I appreciate the download. If you want to go one step further, follow me on social media. I mentioned Twitter earlier, but there's also Facebook, Blue Sky, Instagram, Spoutable, YouTube. But ultimately, if you want to go two steps farther, Patreon is the place to go. That is where for $5 a month you can hear episodes before they come out for free, and you can also watch full video of the episodes. So if that's a selling point for you, $5 a month. At the moment, it's the only price point that we have. It's the only tier that we have. Yeah. So social media or Patreon, or just subscribe and leave a review here, wherever it is that you are hearing me currently. I'd love to hear your feedback or guest suggestions or just any input on the podcast that you may have. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Chance Bonar. Chance Bonar, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm currently a postdoc at Tufts University, just outside of Boston. Work in religious studies, especially religions of the ancient Mediterranean, and focus really heavily on how ancient Mediterranean religions relate to and are impacted by and participate in slavery in the ancient world.
And that is part of our conversation. So over here, for those watching on Patreon, I have the dust jacket, but we're going to be discussing your chapter from Ancient Slavery and its New Testament contexts on Manumission. So you are the second such interview from that book. I had Christy Cobb and Catherine Shaner on, so I'm hoping to work through as many of the chapters as possible. Let's go ahead and get started with the first question I sent you. Would you mind describing the types of manumission that were relevant to people in New Testament era?
Yeah, so there are a few different types that are out there. Some in Roman law, some in Greek law. So it depended on where people lived in the ancient Mediterranean for what kind of laws they would be mostly governed by. And just to start off, like manumission is something that is kind of odd to talk about in modernity because it's the act of an enslaver freeing an enslaved person. So it's under this kind of broad category of emancipation, but it's not a form of freedom that's like forced onto enslavers by let's say like having a civil war and saying there are legal changes that happen. Manumission is kind of built into legal systems of slavery when slavery is legalized in certain societies throughout the world. So it's a weird thing today because like it's kind of like the legal version of manumitting enslaved people, or the legal version of freeing enslaved people, rather than something that's kind of a form of freedom that's like brought about by ending slavery as a practice altogether. But what ancient Mediterranean people experienced when it came to manumission, especially in the New Testament era, are a bunch of different options for how this worked. So within the Roman Empire and under Roman law, there are kind of three major ways that manumission could happen. There's called manumission vindicta, which is like by the rod of some official, some law official, by being added to the census list for Roman citizenship, or through an enslaver's will, that when they die, their last will and testament is read, and they can say, oh, I'm manumitting all of my enslaved people. Along with that, there are these other kind of informal ways that aren't legally binding. So enslavers could manumit people among their friends, get 2 or 3 friends together and say, hey, I'm freeing Onesimus, and they're kind of socially freed even though they're not legally freed, or doing so through a letter saying, hey, I'm going to free you, just so you know. And it's not until in the early Christian period, around like the 3rd and 4th centuries, we start to get this practice of being freed before a church congregation, and that starts to count legally, especially under the newly Christianized Roman Empire. Along with that, in especially the Eastern Mediterranean, there's this weird mix of like Roman and local Greek laws that are playing out. So people could be freed through an enslaver's will at their death. They could save up some money to purchase their own freedom. Cities could very occasionally decide to manumit slaves. This happened, for example, once in the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, where Athens decided to manumit every single enslaved person who was present at a certain battle. And there's also this practice that's really common called sacral manumission, when enslavers, especially in kind of places like Greece and Macedon and Asia Minor, would like record in a public place, like on a wall of a public building or temple, I'm selling this enslaved person to Apollo or Asclepius or some deity, and then eventually they would be freed through that process, that they'd be passed off to a deity who would then manumit them. So there's a bunch of different ways that this plays out in the ancient world. And I know we'll get into it as we go, but it's interesting to note that under Roman law, it was relatively common for people who were manumitted to gain Roman citizenship, whereas in the Greek world that wasn't as common. They didn't like gain city citizenship and become like an Athenian at the end of their time of slavery.
So I kind of want to camp out on the concept of freedom, because I worry that it's so easy to just kind of assume that what we mean by freedom, which does include citizenship, and even citizenship, it's all these legal fictions kind of floating around. Do you mind? Can we camp out a little bit on the concept of freedom? What is the concept of freedom in antiquity as it applies to this particular concept of manumission?
Yeah, the relationship between freedom and manumission is really complicated in antiquity. And I think part of this is that when we hear manumission, we often think like, oh, like, okay, emancipation, freedom from slavery, gaining legal personhood, legal citizenship. And that wasn't always the case in antiquity. One of the things that's really meaningful to understand about the manumission is that, especially in the Roman world, it didn't mean that enslaved persons were able to kind of formally cut ties with their enslavers. Often what happened is, so to give a good example of this, kind of famously, most kind of Roman elites had 3 names, right? So you might know someone as like Marcus Tullius Cicero. Enslaved persons only had 1 name. They're only given 1 kind of legal name within the Roman system. But when they were manumitted, they were given a 2nd name, one of their enslavers' names. So they kind of gained freedom at the cost of still kind of they became like legally tied to their former enslavers' family, and also had different obligations to them, that there were in Roman law still expectations of certain forms of labor that formerly enslaved people had to do for their former enslavers. And they were still kind of legally considered part of, the Roman term for this is the familia. Family is a fine translation, but kind of misleading for us because we don't in modernity, we don't think of like enslaved persons as being part of people's families. But in antiquity, that was the case. They had a really broad concept of what a family or household was. To be an enslaved person or a formerly enslaved person meant to be part of the enslaver's larger familia. They're still kind of the head of the household, or the paterfamilias would be the Latin term for that. They're still in charge of things and in charge of you as a person, even after manumission, and have some say over your life. So freedom here isn't, we need to kind of divorce this from like when we think of like the Civil War and emancipation of enslaved Black people in the U.S. That this didn't mean kind of full legal personhood or full freedom from enslavers, but we could think of it almost kind of similar to like the sharecropper system that emerged after the Civil War, of their enslavers and former enslavers still finding ways to try to control and delimit people after they gain some form of legal freedom.
I've never made this connection before until hearing you say this just now, but I always kind of push back on the idea in a workplace when you hear someone say we're a family here, like that just covers a multitude of sins. And I'm also, look, this is kind of loose, and I don't know if you've listened to the podcast, but I do a lot of free association. I remember reading the first chapter of a Rick Perlstein book, kind of putting you in the shoes of an American industrialist in the early to mid 20th century, and he sees himself as like a paternal figure for the town where his factory is, and now he's put upon by external forces telling him to pay taxes and succumb to regulation and things like that. And it very much, I think I see this as kind of a nexus between our understanding of employment and labor and autonomy, but then also incorporating these ideas of family in there. It's artificial, not in the fake way, but it is a cultural artifact of social and economic control. Am I off base there?
No, I think that's a really great way to describe it. Yeah, that it is like parental and family language was really common in kind of ancient slavery practices. And I think it's a really helpful way to understand why that was the case, because especially in the 19th and 20th centuries, scholars who examined this looked at this like textual material and said, slavery wasn't that bad. I mean, they're saying that they're treating them like brothers and sisters, but we have to be able to read between the lines, and I think that's helpful. A helpful example of how today, like really exploitative businesses will say, "Oh, we're all a family," and we read through that now because we know what that means. So we can apply like the same critical lens to these ancient texts and say, okay, like, sure, you've legally freed them, but they're still in your family and you still control them. So like, that's one of the big questions that scholars of manumission, or something we call this like freed personhood in antiquity, deal with, is like asking this question of how much actually changes for these people. How does their environment and condition change legally and socially?
What would be first I want to say, do we see through it though, Chance? I'm not so sure. So what would be the process for an enslaved person purchasing their own freedom? How likely is that in the evidence?
Yeah, not super likely. I think this is one of the big kind of myths about especially Roman slavery that has impacted kind of both scholars and the general public over the last century. And understanding what this is that manumission rates in the ancient world were relatively high compared to, let's say, manumission in the Atlantic world. But part of that has to do with the way that manumission was kind of like a carrot and a stick, in a sense, that like it's the carrot that can incentivize enslaved persons to act in certain ways, and was used to kind of create obedience or incentivize obedience. And one of the ways was this process, especially in Roman law, called a peculium. It's essentially like a money or land allowance that's given to enslaved people, that they were able to kind of gain this allowance over time, build it up, and sometimes use it to purchase their own freedom. The two things about this that are really kind of problematic, though, one is that the peculium is never legally owned by the enslaved person. The enslaver always owns it. So it's kind of like, if think of like a parent and child today, if they give you an allowance of $10 a week, but they still say, well, it's still my money. I'm just kind of giving it to you, so treat it well. It's kind of that idea. But also that when people purchase their own manumission in the Roman world, typically the cost of manumission was essentially the market price for their replacement. So in some ways, it freed them, but it's not something that it's kind of already built into the way that ancient slavery worked for the Romans, is that they were really comfortable with manumission being part of the way that they would kind of cycle out older enslaved people, cycle in younger people, and keep the system going.
Look, not to make light of a very serious subject, but I can't help it. Are you familiar with the show Community?
Yes, of course.
With the one where my dinner with Andre, dinner with Abed, where they're at the fancy restaurant, and in the tag to the episode, Troy's looking at the check, and he's like, "What market are you shopping at?" I feel like that's where an enslaved person looking to purchase their own freedom would end up, right? It's an uphill battle for them.
Yes, 100%.
So, I mean, the argument, and I had heard this in churches where you're getting the background exegetical stuff in a Bible study or Sunday school, that like, look, guys, it wasn't as bad as chattel slavery, but conceptually, we're talking about people being property.
Yep, conceptually and legally and socially, like Roman slavery was chattel slavery through and through. I think, a lot of it has to do with this myth that built up over the last couple centuries about ancient slavery being better is partially, I mean, it comes out of a couple different things. Part of it is, modern Christians being really uncomfortable with talking about slavery in the Bible, especially because, to give kind of a summary of it, a lot of it has to do, right, with the antebellum period, with the Civil War, and how both abolitionists and pro-slavery white supremacists battled over the Bible. And in the end, one of the big problems for people who work on the Bible and slavery is that historically, the pro-slavery argument was more kind of correct in its reading of the Bible, saying, because they argued the Bible had slavery, there's enslaved persons all over this, we have to deal with that. And abolitionists tried to argue, oh, actually, slavery didn't exist in antiquity, slavery wasn't that bad, let's translate these Greek and Hebrew terms differently. And then, so they kind of lost the battle for kind of the historical reality of slavery in antiquity, because the abolitionists there weren't really correct, and they had to turn to other theological resources to say, okay, they are the correct moral argument, but they didn't have the Bible on their side all of the time. And this is something that really bothers us in modernity, is we have to look at this and be like, well, the Bible's really comfortable with slavery throughout. Like, there are some small resources that we can use to find anti-slavery arguments, but a lot of this textual material is at least thinks that slavery is a normal part of the culture that they live in, and that's really, really disturbing.
So I will throw this out there, and it came up in an interview with Mark Knoll, because he does mention this in America's book, his History of the Bible in America, that he used to share that opinion that, oh man, it was real tough for abolitionists because the Robert Louis Dabneys and people like that were making the quote more biblical argument, and Knoll has since changed his opinion on that. And look, there are people I have scheduled to talk to about readings and approaches to biblical texts, but I think that really does speak to how Christians and Jews engage with biblical texts over time, to the point, and I'll probably bring this, sorry listeners, I'll probably bring this metaphor up again, but having a conversation with my friend Daniel Rodriguez when I was driving home, and I was like, was the definition of marriage two autonomous individuals entering into a contract on equal footing in the context of biblical authors? And he was like, no. And I was like, but are people wrong to read marriage in that interpretation in there? And our understandings of things, of morals, the idea that the concept of rape, I know Barbara Tita talks about this. I'm working on one of her books, that we can't say, oh, our understanding of rape culture exists in any biblical text, but particularly the ones we want to talk about rape with regard to. And so I would say it is a responsibility for people engaging with biblical texts to do so morally, and in a healthy way. And I don't know how much that applies here to slavery. I do want to get into, though, I'll give you a chance to respond to that whole word salad.
No, I mean, I agree, right? Like, that's, I think for, readers of biblical text today, we have to engage with these texts in a meaningful way when it comes to how they sometimes endorse or permit slavery. That I think one of the ways to think about this is, we want to both recognize how we are impacted as readers in the 21st century by kind of the modern history of slavery in the Americas and how we've been taught to read the Bible, and to recognize that it really wasn't until the 1970s that the study of ancient Mediterranean slavery really took off and went in a different direction than this kind of downplayed or erased version that said, oh, it really wasn't that bad. That it's really only been 50 years of research that started to say, this is horrific, this is chattel slavery, we need to, like, both historically and morally wrestle with this and what it means for reading the Bible. And also to recognize that, the Bible isn't a kind of the full story of ancient enslaved persons, right? We don't hear their unfiltered voices through these texts. A really good example of this is from a text written right after the New Testament. Ignatius, he's a bishop at the time, he wrote a letter to Polycarp, where another bishop, and he was trying to say that enslaved persons in Asia Minor, or what's now modern Turkey, shouldn't ask to be manumitted at the church's expense. Which, I mean, a couple things to point out there, right? One is like, okay, Ignatius, that's a horrible thing to say. Like, of course they deserve to be manumitted. But that he wanted to control that or limit the ability to do that. But also that meant that that was probably a practice that was happening in some ancient churches, or at least something that ancient enslaved persons were asking for and expected from their church communities, was to kind of pull into the church coffers and be able to raise funds to manumit them. So we also don't get to hear the full story because biblical texts aren't necessarily directly focused on, especially New Testament texts, aren't like directly focused on the problem of slavery. It's something that for these writers is kind of a thing that's out there in the world, a condition, a system, an institution, but it's not the main focus of their own writing and their own arguments.
And a technology. This came up with Christy Cobb and Catherine Shaner, that I hadn't ever thought of it that way. I'd always realized that, like, oh, we don't need to have enslaved people anymore because we have machines. You could do a lot of digging with excavators and things like that. You don't need human suffering to do a lot of this. But if it's a foregone conclusion that, like, well, we have work to be done and we don't have time and money to spend on it, so the work getting done is a greater priority, it is a greater value than it's a high enough value, it's important enough that we're not going to develop the ideals of individual sovereignty and autonomy, and we benefit from those ideas in the world today, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that's part of our interpretive lens as well, that a person, yeah, okay. What was his rationale for saying they shouldn't ask? Because so it sounds like he's not prohibiting the act of manumitting enslaved people, but he's saying they shouldn't ask, right?
Right.
Okay.
Part of what this comes from, so when he says this, his justification that he gives is, he says, let them not long to be set free, like at the public expense or the church's expense, lest they be found to be slaves of their own desires. So when he does this, he's thinking about, he's thinking, like a lot of early Christians, about slavery in this very broad sense. So there's, kind of like legal and social slavery, but also kind of forms of like spiritual slavery that are still kind of like intertwined to each other. So he's worried that some ancient enslaved Christians will ask for freedom, but that they're actually like risking enslavement to the passions or something along those lines by doing so, because they desire so badly to be freed that it is a new form of slavery. It's a little bit like some of these ancient philosophical arguments, especially people like the Stoics, who were very, very concerned with how people might be kind of overwhelmed and overcome by certain desires or passions. Christians kind of pick up a little bit of this language in order sometimes to um, in Ignatius's case, sometimes to kind of continue to try to control and delimit enslaved people and what they could do, and sometimes to find other kind of methods of freedom.
That's pretty, I don't know, that seems like pretty thin gruel to me.
It's not the best argument. It's really not. Yeah, we should be pushing back on Ignatius for that, and also some other early Christians do. By the third century in Syria, we have this text we call the Didascalia, or the Teachings. It's kind of like a set of church instructions, and in this text, it talks about like what bishops should do. And at least in third century Syria, some bishops were encouraged to manumit slaves using church funds. So Ignatius's argument isn't the only one that's out there.
Well, I mean, that's good. I'm glad it's not the only one that's out there. Is he picking up, is he taking the baton from biblical authors in the New Testament?
It's hard to tell. I mean, a good example of this problem with like what we know about ideas of manumission in the New Testament is actually that it's a pretty sparse idea that's talked about. Like, this isn't something that really comes up too much in our gospel literature, and it mostly comes up in Paul when he's thinking about slavery and manumission in First Corinthians. And this text is kind of, it's important for him to talk about it, especially in First Corinthians chapter 7. He's working through this idea about whether or not Corinthians, people in Corinth, should be kind of seeking to change their status. And this is, he's talking broadly about like, should people be seeking marriage or just stay as they are if they're not married? Should people, is divorce okay or not? Should enslaved people be seeking to be manumitted? And because of Paul's own kind of apocalyptic worldview, that at the time he's like, he thinks Jesus has come back any day now, there's no reason to change your status, according to Paul. So he's like, we're not going to do that. Don't worry about it. Stay as you are. But in the middle of this argument in First Corinthians, he's basically laying out how, for him, he says, well, everyone who's enslaved when Jesus returns is going to become a freed person of Christ. Everyone who's free when Jesus returns will become an enslaved person of Christ. And I think that's really interesting because either way, people still belong to Christ in this argument, right? They're either free and they become enslaved to him, or they're enslaved and they become freed to him. They still are kind of like, they're in his familia, right? They're no longer like conceptualized as property, but they still are, they still owe obligations to Jesus as the manumitter, and they're kind of now former enslaver in Paul's logic. He's really invested in this, especially with Corinth, because this is a city that when the Romans reconstructed it, about a century before he wrote to it, it's a city that's primarily made up out of formerly enslaved persons that were kind of shuttled over from Rome in order to kind of populate this city. So it's a city that has kind of a long history of slavery and manumission, and people that would be very kind of attuned to what Paul is saying.
So I know about 20 years ago, I became kind of an evangelical. I don't know. I don't want to say talking point. That keeps popping in my head, but that's absolutely not what I mean. It became like a principled position for a lot of American evangelicals to oppose trafficking in human persons.
Mm-hmm.
And that has continued on. There's a Christmas concert tour, Behold the Lamb of God, the singer Andrew Petersen. We like to go to, and they I forget which organization it is, but they always kind of draw people's attention to one of these modern day anti-slavery movements. Do you see much similarity in the understanding of I guess, liberating these people and manumitting enslaved people.
Mm.
And you could
Yeah,
say
that's a
past.
good
That's
question.
fine. I understand that's
Yeah,
not what
yeah,
your article is about. I'm just
yeah.
curious.
I mean, I think there are some connections. I think one of the hardest ways that I think one of the things that makes it so weird to talk about manumission today is that in some ways it's a practice that doesn't exist anymore because we don't have kind of modern legal context for slavery, right? Like slavery is illegal under international law, so there's no kind of legal framework in modernity for like modern enslavers to legally manumit and enfranchise enslaved people. But I feel like there are some analogies that that like could help us make sense for like people who get out from conditions of trafficking or like forced or unfree labor through the person who exploited them, right? So like in modernity, like paying your way out or being granted freedom when like their exploiter and then kind of modern enslaver dies. So there's some similarities, but um, it's I, th- I think the hardest thing is that it's it's not totally apples and oranges, but it's so hard to compare because there's not. We live under like such a different legal framework in modernity than antiquity. Where like manumission is like part of how slavery worked. It's built into this. It's one of the cogs of the system in antiquity, rather than like the release valve. So it's such a weird system compared to kind of anti-trafficking movements today.
And I think that may be that it's a criminal conspiracy. So there isn't a continuing relationship at the end, except, and I'm just now realizing, the permissive language in the 13th Amendment that allows essentially to enslave, to treat
Mm-hmm.
inmates like enslaved persons. And then there is the parole process. That doesn't mean you're entirely out of prison. And if you, so that might be the best,
Mm-hmm.
the close, and if you disagree, that's fine, but that might be the closest analogy, that you still have this link to the criminal justice system that can draw you back into its service under, and like, basically slave conditions.
Yeah, I mean, I think parole is a good example. Yeah, for like it's a good analogy for what ancient manumission looked like because yeah, you're still kind of legally bound to the former exploiter and have certain kind of legal obligations to them, often having to do with doing particular types of work, treating them in a quote unquote respectable manner. Uh, yeah, I think that's a helpful comparison to make here.
Well, good. You're welcome, everybody. Um, so you mentioned in the chapter that Augustus limited the amount, or actually, what is that? What did he limit with regard to manumission?
Yeah, okay, there's a lot to unpack here, so I'm excited you mentioned Augustus. So there are kind of three major laws that Augustus introduced. So Augustus, the best way I think about Augustus is like Augustus gives major mega vibes, that he's very much wanting to make Rome great again, and he's really invested in doing this through kind of a series of laws that are meant to kind of um, reimagine and recreate what he thinks Rome ideally used to be, and that he has this imagination that like it's all been corrupted, it's falling apart. We need to restore Rome to its greatness. So there are three laws that he introduces over a period of 20 years. Just to give us the names: the Lex Unia Urbana, the Lex Fufia Canania, and the Lex Aelia Sentia. So he introduces all these between the years like 17 BCE and 4 CE. Um, and I'll tell us what he does and then why he does it. So some of the things that he starts to limit is he says enslavers can only manumit enslaved persons once the enslaved person is 30 years old or older, with some exceptions. Uh, Enslavers need to be at least 20 when they start to manumit people. Uh, people Enslaved persons who are enslaved because of doing certain types of crimes, if they're manumitted, they can't gain Roman citizenship anymore. So they can't like make a will or testament afterwards. They can't participate in like Roman inheritance structures. They can't pass on any inheritance to anyone else. And in some cases, they don't even have the rights of like what's called kind of Latin rights. They don't have the rights, even not even of Roman citizens or of people who live on the Italian peninsula. They get kind of the short end of the stick, which is the legal rights of people who live in the provinces. even though they might be enslaved in Rome itself. And part of this is that, as well, Augustus was really interested in limiting the number of enslaved persons that an enslaver could manumit through their last will or testament, based on the size of this enslaver's estate. So this could be anywhere to only being allowed to manumit somewhere between like 1/2 to 1/5 of their enslaved persons, depending on how many they owned. So basically, why Augustus was doing this, part of this is like his own imagination of wanting to control and delimit what Roman elites were capable of doing, and part of it is that how do I want to put this? Well, so why this was controversial for Augustus to do this, to put all these laws in place, is that as Roman emperor, he was essentially meddling with the power of the paterfamilias, right, the heads of the households, so the Roman elite men. So this is kind of like the equivalent of, like, let's say like there's an American politician today who says that government agents can enter your house. They can legally enter your house and do what they want, but this happens in a stand your ground state. You can imagine that's kind of, right, you're having like these two issues of like who gets political and social control in this space kind of butting heads. Does the president and the government get control, or does the person who owns this house and whose property you're on have kind of control? So Augustus is kind of like threatening the power of elite Romans by saying that he claimed that they were like indiscriminate with their manumission practices, that they were freeing too many enslaved people before their death because they wanted to like boost their social profile posthumously and boost their funerary rights by having all of these enslaved people kind of part of their funerary procession. So there's a lot to unpack there.
Okay, so, and this kind of goes to the idea of the imperator being like the top paterfamilias of all, so the one dad to rule them all.
Exactly. So he's messing with all the other dads by saying, I'm the daddiest dad, which is...
Oh, that's fantastic. We can stop there. No, go on.
But this is exactly the problem, is that he's going up against other people who are like, in Roman law have traditionally had kind of, with sometimes with the exception of like the power of life and death, could basically do what they want with people that are in their familia, including enslaved persons and freed persons. And Augustus, as the first Roman emperor, is starting to get in the way of that and says, actually, I want to control what you do here, and that causes problems.
So I remember from the HBO show Rome, I don't even think it was to the level of exposition, because I don't think it ever came back up. Or maybe it didn't. But there's a line of dialogue that someone's basically talking about the inflated number of enslaved people is suppressing the ability of freed persons to find like gainful employment. Was that? I mean, it seems like this would not his reforms would not solve that. But was that a problem in that time?
For some Roman politicians, this was considered a bit of a problem. I mean, one of the weird things also about slavery in antiquity, and why it wasn't necessarily a huge, like this idea of like this influx of enslaved immigrants, we could, let's say, taking away the jobs of good hardworking Romans, doesn't play out totally, because enslaved persons in antiquity worked almost any job. There were only a few jobs that they actually were not were barred from, like couldn't be part of the military, couldn't be part of public office, but otherwise, could be doctors, could be scribes, and of course many worked in mines and in ancient plantations and in ancient households. So there wasn't as much. It wasn't as big of maybe as big of an issue as HBO's Rome was going for, but it was, what definitely was a concern for a lot of elite Romans was kind of the typical problem of colonialism, which is the Romans colonized and enslaved so many people across the Mediterranean, brought many of these enslaved persons back to like Italy or to Sicily to help work to help them create the grain and food and live the lives that they wanted to live, but then started to be mad because there are all these non-Roman people in Rome, and it's like, okay, well, that's your own fault. Obviously, you enslaved them and colonized them and destroyed their lives. But this is part of what Augustus is also responding to is part of his kind of like make Rome great again campaign, is also trying to make clearer boundaries between kind of, who he considers to be kind of the Romans who are really Roman, the people who are, born and raised elite Roman, and this kind of up and coming class of manumitted persons who are becoming more influential and prominent in Rome, that are able, after their freedom is granted to them, who became citizens, who were able to gain some level of political and financial power. So it's also him kind of responding to the fact that there are all these people that he thinks are, not really Roman, who don't deserve to have the same rights as Romans. So he's trying to like kind of slow down that system.
Correct me if this is not an apt metaphor, but for the last 80 years, Americas have called the shots on the world stage. And I think a lot of what we're seeing politically now is maybe a hangover from those successes, because, like the blowback from a win could mean the loss of, so manufacturing being offshored means fewer manufacturing jobs, a larger service sector economy, which is not as stable or lucrative on the labor side, on the supply side for labor, but it also affects the culture. I mean, if you go anywhere where there was a military installation active in the Vietnam era, you are going to see a lot of Thai restaurants. You're going to see a lot, like, it's just the culture in the area changes, and over time it adapts. And my understanding of people being integrated into Rome was they got conquered, they were provincial, and then eventually they were made citizens, and that expansion. But it sounds like you're saying rapid success led to rapid changes, and they didn't, like, it didn't go through the proper order that it had previously gone through, or over the timeline. It was happening a lot faster.
It was happening, yeah, especially in the second and first centuries BC. Like, this is when kind of Roman colonial expansion really picks up pace, and yeah, more and more people are being, like, hundreds of thousands are being enslaved and brought to Rome or brought to Italy. And this leads to a lot of like elite Roman anxiety, where they start to, kind of um, worry deeply about how enslaved and then freed people are part of their world, especially because in uh, in the ancient Mediterranean, even after being manumitted, there's still kind of this kind of stain of slavery that's kind of socially impacted and kind of stigmatized freed people. So even after manumission, there's still this idea that, like, well, you must have been enslaved for a reason, something, even though Romans generally understood that, like, slavery is something that could happen to anyone, it could happen to them, that it's just kind of essentially luck of the draw in warfare as to who wins and who loses, who is free and who's enslaved. They still at the same time have this kind of stereotype about people who have been enslaved as kind of being off, being wrong, not being as good as kind of elite Romans themselves.
So not the explicit racialized understanding that we had in American chattel slavery, but still like a hierarchical, you're inferior, you're okay.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about freedom a little bit. How much did early Christian views of freedom overlap with the kind of greater legal understanding of freedom that you talked about earlier?
Yeah, they overlapped a little bit. Um, Early Christians had, a range of views of what freedom meant. I mean, you have someone like Paul and his kind of view in that, he thought that the end times were coming. So for him, freedom mostly is something that he imagines comes kind of in and through Christ, likely at the end times. So you could think of the famous passage from Galatians 3, right? That there's no slave or free, and it goes on to say in Christ Jesus. Um, And of course, this passage is really controversial because one of the things that Paul does here, right, is he essentially says, well, in Jesus, these legal statuses of enslaved or free don't really matter. But it's unclear to, generations, centuries of Christians, whether he means that kind of in the social sphere or just in like the theological sphere. Is he saying that slave and free don't matter as statuses in the world that we live in, or like uh, in our kind of spiritual relationship to one another? So this is something that early Christians are still like we're trying to figure out for themselves. Some were really comfortable with saying that we should be manumitting enslaved people because slave and free doesn't matter anymore as like a legal division. And others who said, well, Christians were all Christians are free internally in Jesus, but externally, I don't know if we can change that. Uh, and this played out for a while. I mean, probably the best example, the guy who's usually Christian scholars of Christian history point to as kind of the proto-abolitionist of early Christians is Gregory of Nyssa. He's writing in the 4th century, and he's someone who, in his writing, talks a lot about how so he's reading things like the book of Genesis, especially Genesis 1, the creation of Adam and Eve, to say that humans weren't made to be enslaved to one another. They're made to, in Genesis, in the Garden of Eden, or before that, in the creation of Adam and Eve, God made humans to rule over creation, so shouldn't be enslaved to one another. But even there, even with our kind of proto-abolitionist Gregory, who thinks that all enslaved people should be manumitted, part of his argument is he says, how dare humans treat God's property as their own? So even he says, well, humans are property. They're just not proper. They're not supposed to be property of one another. So we run into this. What something that really fascinates me, right, is this theological problem of a lot of early Christians, even those who take very kind of pro-manumission, pro-freedom stances, still have this kind of even broader picture of they're calling for freedom because they think that God is the enslaver of everyone.
So not necessarily what we would call libertarians.
Fair, yeah. They don't get to the point of kind of abolitionism in the way that it's developed in the modern period.
Okay, so we're coming kind of close to our time limit, so I'll transition into my closeout questions. Was there anything in the chapter that you were really hoping I would ask about that I have not?
I think one of the things would be that some of the limitations that were put on freed people after their manumission were in part because there was such a deep concern, especially in the Roman world, especially kind of the late Roman Republic, early Empire, around how manumission could be used as a political tool. We talked about this a little bit already with like Augustus kind of getting frustrated with people that like seemed too benevolent in their death by manumitting all their enslaved people, and his own kind of xenophobia around like worrying that there are too many quote unquote foreigners in Rome who were becoming Romans and claiming Roman citizenship. But we even see this in like a little bit earlier in the early 1st century BCE. Sulla, this really famous dictator and murderer of his political opponents, tried to manumit somewhere up to like 10,000 enslaved people to gain their loyalty and to coerce some of them to murder their enslavers who were on his list of people that he wanted killed, his political opponents. So also to recognize that when we're talking about manumission in antiquity, we're also talking about this feature of this legal system that functioned as a political tool sometimes, that people would put to use to, I mean, we can think of this in relationship to, instances in the Civil War where that, Confederate soldiers, Confederate generals promised freedom to black soldiers who fought on their side against the Union, or vice versa. That sometimes this is freedom is being used as an incentive in order to gain political power.
Yeah, that is. Yeah, no, that's helpful. I'd forgotten that Sulla did that. And because we're about to go into recommendations, I'll say, listeners, I would recommend Tom Holland's Rubicon. It's just a really fun, very readable recounting of, Caesar and Pompey and all of that. But he does give the background of Marius and Sulla and their pre-Civil War, Civil War. Where would you direct listeners? Like, what would you have them read, watch, listen to learn more about Manumission or ancient enslaved people or enslavers?
Yeah, so along with the book that this chapter is a part of, Ancient Slavery in its New Testament Context, I would say the two biggest books from Manumission specifically, one is a 1995 book by J. Elbert Harrell called The Manumission of Slaves in Early Christianity. Gives a really, really helpful overview of kind of everything from the 1st to 4th centuries, walks through how early Christians imagined manumission, sometimes fought against it, sometimes fought for it. Another really helpful book from 2011, Henrik Moritson's The Freedmen in the Roman World, which is a really, really great book for just kind of an overview of the legal structure of manumission and what a day in the life of a freed person might look like in antiquity. And just in general for ancient slavery, probably the book that I would say is most helpful, it's a read, but it's very helpful, is Jennifer Glancy's Slavery in Early Christianity. Glancy is the one who, they just released kind of like a 20-year anniversary edition of this book with a kind of, it's revised and updated. But this was a book that was originally published in the early 2000s that really kickstarted the field of kind of Bible and slavery studies, that got us all really invested in the topic in the first place, and is just the best resource to work through how we can talk about slavery and the New Testament and early Christianity and what Christians did or didn't do in relation to slavery.
And I know this isn't really your wheelhouse necessarily, but are there organizations that you think listeners should go to learn more about slavery in the modern world, or that they could support to help people who are in those kind of conditions today?
Yeah, I would say the one that immediately comes to mind is the work of Kevin Bales. I think his website's kevinbales.net. That he's a scholar of modern slavery. So on his website, he has kind of various lectures, TED Talks, YouTube videos that are kind of working through the prevalence and the conditions of modern slavery today, to talk about conditions of billions of people who are still being enslaved and trafficked in modernity. It also has resources on his page about kind of the best places to turn to offer support.
Okay, nice. So a collection of things there. I'll have that and the books that you mentioned in the show notes. What do you read for fun?
Oh, is there time to read for fun? No, no. I've been having a lot of fun right now reading through a mixture of more nerdy academic books. For example, Sarah Bond's new book Strike, which is all about like labor and unions in the Roman Empire and Roman Republic, but also have been having a lot of fun reading through Green Grass Running Water, which is a Canadian Indigenous story that is really, really, really fun to work through, and kind of sometimes kind of goofy because the coyote figure in the story tells things in a very kind of topsy-turvy way.
Say more. I'm listening.
Yeah, it's a story that's told from like the perspective of multiple individuals throughout the story. So like each chapter kind of starts to build on each other as all these characters kind of start to slowly meet together by the end of the narration. This is a slightly older book. It's a 1993 novel, but it's meant to be kind of essentially like Indigenous satire on like Western society, on Christianity, where this trickster god Coyote is kind of slowly bringing these characters together, but is also like making fun of from an outsider perspective the weirdness of like biblical stories.
Okay. Yeah. No. I'm. It's not a concern at all how old the book is. I'll have that in the links too. That sounds
Yeah.
interesting. What else do you? Since you, whenever I hear someone say like, "Oh, who has the time?" Even though you gave some, what else do you do to decompress?
Um, Usually, so cross stitching, embroidery. I've gotten kind of into that kind of crafting recently, as well as singing, being a part of local choirs when I can.
Okay. Fun stuff. Okay. Well, unless you have anything else for us, I'm going to call this one good.
Sounds good to me.
Chance Bonar, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Take care. Thank you so much for listening. Yeah, I appreciate the downloads. Like I said at the top, like I said on the front end, I'd appreciate any feedback on this conversation or the podcast in general. If there are improvements that you think that I could make, hit me up with that. Next week on the podcast, Kyle Hughes will be discussing his book, Scripting the Sun. And you can hear that conversation now for $5 a month on Patreon. It's an interesting book about how ancient people read biblical texts. And there was some wrestling for me, and that does come up in the conversation. You know, I let him know, full disclosure, your book was very challenging for me, and I wanted him to get through discussing the basics of the book, what the book was intended to be before we got to that. But we do eventually get to the trouble or misgivings, however you want to characterize it, that I had while I was reading that book, and that's a confluence of things from my own background. Yeah, but here is a quick preview of next week's conversation that, again, if you're listening for free, you can hear it right now for $5 a month. Thank you. And if you get a chance to love someone, you should take it.
All of us have to read scripture in line with some kind of presuppositions, some kind of overall worldview or approach. So within that, what I said was my belief that if all of scripture is inspired by the one God, and it all tells the one story of Jesus Christ, that presupposition allows us to look for Christ throughout the Old Testament. And if the witness of the church fathers tells us anything, it's that, yeah, there is some creativity at work in this process, where some church fathers will look at some passages and say, this dialogue between father and son is taking place at the time of the enthronement. Whereas another scholar says, no, this, or church father says, no, this particular dialogue between father and son takes place at the time of the incarnation. And they disagree with one another. And I think that's okay. I think ultimately the check and balance on prosopological exegesis, but as well on all interpretation, is ultimately what we call the rule of faith or the creed, right? The basic orthodox commitments that we all share as Christians. And so if someone wants to read Genesis 1 as dialogue between father and son, to say that God the Father is speaking to God the Son, to create. And that lines up, for example, with John 1, all things were created through him. So, right, we believe that Scripture teaches, according to the Creed, that God created the heavens and the earth. John 1, that the Son played a role in this creation. So this interpretation, maybe we can't prove that that's the intended meaning, but it's in line with the hypothesis, with the economy of Scripture, as Irenaeus would call it.